Hi, how many have we got on the line? Oh, good number of people there. So I'm in Auckland. I'm just going to close the door where I am. I'm in Auckland in New Zealand, and we've got my colleagues Chris and Nicola. Which country are you in, Chris and Nicola?
We are currently with Rise Impact in Thailand.
Great. And we've got people from all over the place attending. So it's great to have everyone here. Thanks for joining for the second webinar where we're covering the theory of change. I'll quickly run through our housekeeping. So please put yourself on mute when you're not speaking. And if you want, you can select the gallery view on the top right-hand corner to see everyone's faces. Feel free to type questions in the boxes, and if I miss them, Chris will notice them and bring them up. And also the call is being recorded. So just so you're aware of that, and we'll get going. So there's lots to cover in this session. Please ask any questions as we go. If there's something that isn't making sense, if I've used a word that I haven't defined, let me know. If you've just got an interesting point to share, then please feel free to pitch in. So what we'll cover today is a refresh of session 1. We'll go through some of those definitions again, so it's clear for people. And remember that some of the definitions were in the handout notes from session 1, so you can refer back to those if that's helpful. We'll then do an introduction to impact management, talk about the theory of change, talk about how we understand the problem, and then we'll cover off the homework and questions and answers. Just so you know, in the next session, we'll be talking about how you can teach this. So this session now is theory of change and how you can develop a theory of change for an organisation. And then the following session is how you would facilitate that process. So how you run a workshop and help develop the theory of change. So the learning objectives for this session are to understand the role of the theory of change as a hypothesis that needs to be tested. You should be able to identify the different stages of a theory of change, be able to identify what qualifies as a logical link, be able to develop and improve theories of change for ventures, and understand the difference between symptoms and causes. So a recap from the first session, but also the fundamental components of a basic theory of change is this slide here. So first of all, the thing that we ask when we're developing a theory of change is, what is the end result that you want to get to? What's the good thing that you want to see change in the world or for the environment, for people, because of what you're doing? What is that good result? And the second question is, what's a good approach to take to get to that good result? And then the third part is, does it make sense that taking that approach would lead to that good result? So here we've got a basketball player throwing a ball into a hoop that follows a parabolic curve. It won't always get into the hoop. The basketball player might be too far away from the hoop or might use too much force or not enough, but there is a logic that links the two. So the basic fundamental components of a theory of change is the logic that links what you're doing to the change that you want to see. Can everyone please just check that they're on mute if they're not speaking? I'm just hearing a little bit of background noise there. Thank you. So the theory of change is an important part of the strategy. We'll go into this in more detail, but just as an overview, the strategy is your first plan that's going to guide your thinking. When you've got your strategy, which encompasses a theory of change, you'll then start to work out how you you'll then work out how you can measure against that strategy. So the theory of change is your starting point. Then coming off your theory of change, you'll start to work out how you can measure whether the change is happening or not. And through measuring and gathering data, you'll gain insights that help you manage what you're doing towards achieving that positive social or environmental change that you want to see, the impact that you want to see, or the outcomes. Same words, different words for the same thing. So the components of the impact management framework are a theory of change. That's what we're going to spend today's session on, plus indicators, which are measures or proxies, things that help you collect the data, plus your data collection methods. So your theory of change could be your story of how change happens, your hypothesis of how change is going to happen, your plan. Your indicators are the little clues that change is going to happen. So they might be, sorry, we're just changing around the speakers so it's clearer for you to hear me if that's a problem. The indicators are the clues that something has happened. So for example, in the theory of change, one of the outcomes could be that parents have more confidence. The indicator could be that parents report that they had X amount of confidence at the start of the program and Y amount of confidence at the end of the program. And the way you would collect that data is with a survey of the parents. Okay. Can everyone still hear me? Chris and Nicola, can you hear me now that we've plugged in this other speaker?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. So these are so I said that the basketball player was the basic simple components of the theory of change. This is the next most simple version of the theory of change. It's still super simple. So these are the elements of a theory of change in its simplest form. The first part is the key issue, what's the issue that you're trying to address. The next thing is the activity. What's the good approach that you're taking in order to see the positive change that you want to see? The next thing is the output, what immediately happens that you can count and see because of what you're doing. And then what changes because of that activity. Finally, what changes because of that activity that leads to the good result, the positive social or environmental change that you want to see. And importantly, along the bottom there, you can see these arrows that link them all up. Why does it make sense? So why does it make sense that that activity would lead to those outcomes? Is it logical? So those logical links are really important parts of the theory of change. Here's an example. So the thing this company does is build and sell low pollution cook stoves. The thing that happens immediately is that households use those low pollution cook stoves. So that could be something that you could count. You could count the number of families that have the cook stoves, the number of families that are using the cook stoves. But you still don't know whether change has happened for those families. The way you know whether change has happened is by measuring the indoor air pollution, which is decreased. So that's what happens in the short, medium and long term for those families. Actually, probably other things happen that are positive in the long term, such as improved health. But in the short term, the outcome that would happen, the change that we see is indoor air pollution decreasing. And so that would lead to the ultimate result of the outcomes, which is people are healthier. Here's another example. Hopefully the examples are helpful. I find it helpful seeing actual examples, even though they're simple ones, because just the theory by itself doesn't really bring it to life. So now we'll use the example of parents in a parenting program, learning how to be the best parents that they can be. So the issue is that parents are not supported to be strong parents. In some contexts, in a past time, in an older time, the issue might have been that there's too much domestic violence. Now we've learnt that it's much more appropriate to take a strengths-based approach. And so we often don't even use the word issue because it can seem deficit-based. Sometimes we'll talk about like what's happening, or in your context you can come up with whatever word works for you, but what you're trying to establish is what's the baseline, what's the burning platform, what are you responding to? So in this case, we've got parents are not supported to be strong parents. The activity that we're doing is running a parenting program. The that we're working with, the stakeholders, in order to achieve the change that we want to see, the people we're working with, are the parents and their children. The outputs are that X number of parents attended Y number of sessions. So we can count that. We can see that the parents have turned up, easy, tick the box, attendance record. So as a consequence of running a parenting program with those parents and children, the change that we see is that parents gain tools, parents gain confidence. As a consequence of the parents gaining tools, more parents spend positive time with their children, which leads to stronger family relationships. In the middle there, we have parents gain confidence, which leads to parents reading to their children more, which leads to increased cognitive development, which leads to children arriving at school ready to learn. And along the bottom there, we've got that because the parents are gaining confidence and coming to this parenting program, they're making friends, and so the parents have a stronger support network. You'll see there that the thread along the bottom, it doesn't have an arrow that leads to children arriving at school ready to learn. It's great that the parents have stronger support networks, but it's not necessary for us to achieve our long-term impact. So that's an ancillary outcome, and we could probably leave it off our theory of change. The most important outcomes that lead to the long-term impact there are the ones that are highlighted gold. We call that the golden thread. You can call it whatever you want, but it's a helpful way of refining within your theory of change and making sure that the most important outcomes are included, and those are the outcomes that lead to the long-term impact you want to see. So within the theory of change, there are logical links. Each of those arrows should be logical. Parents reading to their children more is logically likely to lead to increased cognitive development. There's evidence that says that this is the case. We've got international evidence that links reading to children with increased cognitive development. You might have seen it yourself. You might have collected data yourself. So you might have your own measurement, but you can also rely on other people's research. So if we go back to that theory of change, each of those arrows need to be either supported by evidence, supported by strong logic that you intend to test by measuring, or supported by what you've seen already and have evidenced with data collection. Okay, so we're just going to work through those different components of the theory of change so that you're really clear on what it is and how you would develop each part of it. Please stop me at any point if you've got any questions. The point of today's session is to get you really comfortable with the theory of change and how you would think about it for an organisation, how you would help them to develop it. The purpose obviously is to help them get clear on what impact they're trying to have and how they can show the logical link between their activities and the ultimate impact they want to have, and what the short, medium and long-term outcomes are, so that they're in a really strong position to be able to measure their impact, because the outcomes are the things that they'll develop indicators against so that they can measure. Any questions, let me know. So first step is to define the issue. That's that burning platform, the why are you here, what's going on in the community that you're operating in, what's going on for the people that you're seeking to benefit, why is there an issue? What is the issue and why is there an issue? So when you're trying to understand this point, it's good to go out and do some stakeholder engagement, do some desktop research, figure out what it is that you don't know and what you need to know more about. It's also important to think about at which point of the issue you're working. So is someone working, are you trying to address the pointiest end of the issue, the big picture, or just one part of it in one community? Also consider how it's been dealt with successfully elsewhere. Have they published what they learnt? Is there peer review literature to suggest how others have responded to this issue? How have your organisation's activities operated in the past to respond to this issue? And have you seen change as a consequence? So, sorry, this is the point I made just before about which level of the issue are you working at? Are you seeking to address the symptoms or the causes? So, for example, in the area of poverty, it might be that it's such a multifaceted issue. You might be working at the bottom of the cliff because someone has to, and providing food to people who are homeless, who are starving. Or you might be working with people who are likely to become homeless, but to get them into stable employment and support them to achieve their goals. When it's not necessarily right that an organisation should play at either one of the ends, because both might need to be addressed, but it's really important for you to work out at which point you're operating. Partly because you may need to engage partners to achieve your goal. If you're seeking to end homelessness, but all you're doing is the soup kitchen, giving out food, then you're unlikely to end homelessness unless you engage partners, for example, housing providers. So in the area of homelessness, you could ask the questions, why are people living in homelessness? Is it a mental health issue? Is it a problem debt issue? Is it a government issue where the policies have changed and social housing is no longer provided? Why is it that they don't have a house? Why is it that they don't have money? If it's because he or she is not able to work, is that because of the system? Is it because that person has a reason that they don't want to work? Are their goals actually not around employment, but around connection to community and family? And if you support that person just around employment, they maybe won't want to engage with your service because that's not what their actual goal is. So these are all questions that you can ask to better understand the issue that you're trying to work in. So this problem tree is a useful tool to split apart that issue. It can be a useful exercise to do with social enterprises, to pull apart the issue, dive into those symptoms versus causes, and work out where you're best placed to be addressing the issue. So for example, here we've got the air pollution scenario again. We've got high indoor pollution from cooking stoves. So some of the causes of that is that alternative fuels are expensive, and transport is expensive. So the transport is expensive, is contributing. We've got in the middle there, we've got that existing low smoke stoves are expensive, and existing low smoke stoves break easily, and existing low smoke stoves are complicated to manufacture. So for these reasons, there aren't many alternatives for people. There's also a preference for the existing approach, and there's limited understanding of alternative options. So from this, we can see that there's a cost issue, there's an availability issue, and there's also a behaviour issue. So by splitting it apart into those three different areas, you can see if maybe you're going to need to address all three to achieve the positive change that you want. And if you're only well placed to address one or two of them, then maybe you need a partner to work with for the other one. Or it might be that you can say, no, actually other people are already working really well on the behaviour change and the expense side, but we need to work on that availability thing to support those providers to achieve their outcomes better. So who is involved? That's the next question. Who are your people or your places or your land, your planet that you're working to support? Because this might be relevant for an environmental organisation as well. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick question quick second to have a look at the questions that have popped up. We've asked if there are any if there are many activities to deal with the issues, which kinds of activities to choose to put on this map. Chris, have you that popped up?
Yeah, so I think we think that the problem tree is probably the tool for that. So I highlighted that for the team, and that tool helps you identify which of the areas you can actually contribute to, because some of those causes may be outside your control, or some may already be being dealt with by other partners. So I think hopefully, Clemmie, I think what you explained should cover that question that came in before you talked about problem trees.
Great. Thanks. You anticipated what I would talk about. Okay, so back to the who. So remember our theory of change parts. We've talked about the issue. The next part is the people/planet. Who are your stakeholders? Who's impacted in a material way? So this can be quite tricky to figure out who are your stakeholders, because often a social enterprise has ripple effects. So it may be benefiting, say, the parents. We'll use the example of the parents and the children. In that example, the organisation is deliberately targeting the parents. It's working with the parents. So it's really obvious that they are a key stakeholder, and they never actually see the children. But the reason that they run, the reason they exist, is to support the parents to help the children. So those children are impacted in a material way. They're deliberately experiencing change because of the program. The children, the parents and the children in that family are the ones who are your stakeholders, but you might also see positive change in that community. The grandparents might benefit, the cousins might have learnt some of the techniques that the parents learnt, and they might also be benefiting. So you can see how there's this sort of ripple effect out. It can be sometimes really hard to know where to draw the line, and this this thing of saying, well, we're just going to draw the line at whoever is impacted in a material way, sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's really not. We don't have a hard and fast rule of this is who is in and this is who is out. The way I try to think of it is it's basically the people who the program is designed to benefit. So in the parenting program, the program is designed to benefit those children.
I'm just going to jump in. So Abigail's just noted that she's finding it a little bit hard to hear you. I'm not sure whether we can get the microphone a little bit closer, maybe.
Okay. Okay. We'll try that, and if that's no better, then I'll revert to my computer's microphone. Is that any better?
I can hear you okay. Abigail, how's that now?
Yeah, it's a little bit better. Thank you.
Sorry, we've got this super
Thank you.
Okay, we'll try that. If I'm yelling and it's too loud, tell me as well. Okay, so we've talked about who benefits from the service, but there are other stakeholders that you might want to include. For example, if you're a social enterprise, a key stakeholder might be your customers, and they might experience positive change that actually contributes to the long-term outcome. We'd say here to only include the stakeholders who significantly contribute to or experience positive change because of the program. So we wouldn't include anyone who, we don't include in a theory of change back office things. So if you think of fundraising, for example, as a back office function that just gives the funding to be able to run the program, then we wouldn't include that. And sometimes with social enterprises, having a customer buy the product that you're selling is equivalent to having doing a fundraising drive and getting donations. So we wouldn't necessarily include the customer if that's their only role, but often the customer plays a role in achieving the impact. They may be demonstrating that by buying the product, they are showing the world that consumers will shift if there's a product that supports the environment. And that's your long-term play, is to be a demonstration organisation to support more of the corporate world to move across. If that's the case, then yes, your customers would be a stakeholder in your theory of change. You might also include a significant funder or government agency if part of your theory of change is to get them on board and across the line and increasing the impact. So again, if you're a demonstration model where you're trying to prove what change could look like, or that if the government or corporates did things in a different way, then you'd see much more positive change, then you need to be seeing change for them along the journey. So you'd include them. Okay, so once you've got your stakeholders, and generally to get the stakeholders, I'd sort of like list them all out and then try and group them and then refine. So put everyone who could be involved with your ripple effect ones, group them into the kinds of stakeholders. So maybe the ones who benefit, the ones who support, and the ones who are like doing the work potentially, and then put that lens over it of, are they impacted in a material way? And then put that lens over it of, are they contributing to the change to support you in your refinement process. Okay, so the activities is, to identify the activities, it's actually a similar approach to the stakeholders. You want to list out everything that you're doing, and it seems simple, that identifying the activities, because most organizations know what they do, but often organizations are a little bit reactive to the need, and so they do a lot of different things, and it can be hard to isolate down to what the, say, 3 activities are that they really want to be known for and that they really want to be achieving positive change because of. It's also sometimes difficult to delineate between the business function and the impact generating part of what you do. So you don't need to include the activities like doing your payroll and paying your taxes and all those parts that any organization has to do. You just want to list your core activities, and often they are the activities that are the ones that you use to describe what you do. So if you're anything like me, you probably have over time, or if the organizations are like me, they've probably practiced over time telling people what they're doing and trialing and error, through trial and error, trying different ways to describe what they do and getting as punchy as possible. Kind of like the elevator pitch, but even tighter because it's just their activities. So those are the activities that they do. I'm assuming from what I've said that the organization already has some activities that they're doing. This process can also be used for organizations that have a big issue and want to be generating change, but they haven't started doing anything yet. So in that case, they can have a hypothesis and guess at which activities they want to do based on what they have seen has worked before. So it can be based on research, based on their own observations, or importantly, it can be based on talking to the community and asking them what they want. So there's an often overlooked point that the people who are experiencing the disadvantage may have the tools and the solution, the answers. So that can be the first best starting point for identifying which activities should be done to lead to the positive change. So once you've considered your issue, who you're working with, who your stakeholders are, and what your activities are, the next thing is the outputs. So the outputs are the things that happen immediately, and often they are they're the direct result of your activities. They're usually the things that can be counted or seen. If you think about traditional social service delivery, where a funder, a government agency, or someone has given a contract with KPIs, key performance indicators, and they've said, we want you to run a doctor's clinic and you have to see 500 patients. So we want you to tell us when you've seen 500 patients. That's your output. It doesn't actually show you if anything has changed for those patients. We can assume that something's changed because doctors generally know things, and hopefully they've administered some medical procedure or or given the patient some medicine that will help them and they've had a correct diagnosis. But we don't actually know if things have changed. All we know is that 500 patients came through the door. So the outputs are the count of things that have happened without showing that any change has really happened. So, for example, 100 people attend the work readiness program. So on to the outcomes. The outcomes are the hardest part. If you're trying to help an organisation to identify their theory of change, to develop their theory of change, or if you're trying to do it yourselves, I'd reserve the most time for the outcomes. The other parts are things that they should already know, most of what's happening. It's just a refinement process. The outcomes are more challenging. So here we've got the example again of the reading program. Parents are gaining tools and confidence, which leads to them reading to their children more, which leads to increased cognitive development. In order to identify what changes, in order to identify the outcomes, you need to learn what changes because of an activity. There are lots of different ways you can do that, and we'll go into more of them in the next session. But basically, you need to either observe or ask the stakeholders, observe what's happening. So the people who are running the programs may have seen things. You can ask the people who are receiving the benefit from the program what changes for them. You can look at research to see what has changed in the past. And what you're wanting to get to is what changes because of these activities. Often it's easiest to find out what the short-term outcomes are. So if an organisation's been running for a while, the things that first come to mind are the short-term changes that happen. It's those longer-term things that happen because of that first wave of change that are much more difficult to identify. So normally when I'm working with an organisation, I find myself saying over and over and over, and then what happens, and then what happens. Often also there's a bit of a narrowed focus for people because they limit their focus to what a contract might have asked or what a customer might be buying. So it can be really helpful to try and broaden that and say what else happens in people's lives because of the change that's happening here. So for example, in the parenting program, we may have only focused on the children being, having that cognitive development. And if we'd been doing that and we'd been hearing just about the parents reading to their children more, we might not have broadened it out and learnt about the relationships, the stronger relationships in the family, and how those strong relationships were actually the ones that also led to the increased cognitive development and set the children up for success to be arriving at school ready to learn. Okay, so we'll spend more time in the exercise, for the homework exercise, and in the next session talking about outcomes. But what you really need to understand now is that the outcomes are the change that happens for people. And importantly, we want to see that change all the way through from the activity to the ultimate impact, which means that you probably need to be staging it. You need to see what happens immediately, what happens as a consequence of that, what happens as a consequence of that, and then finally, how does that lead to your impact? And how do we know that there is a logical link between each one? Over time, that change from the activity, and we can immediately count the outputs, we can probably see change happening with the outcomes through to the impact. There's a bit of a like drawing away for us from that. So you can imagine that when you've run a program, you can immediately see the change that happens in the short term, and you can count the outcomes. You're really close to that action. You can see it, you're controlling it, and it's because of you. You know that it was your program that did it because it, say, happened the day that they were in the program with you, or immediately after purchasing that cook stove. You don't know necessarily if the families are getting healthier because of the cook stove, or if that was because they also had another program supporting them to get healthier food. So the further away from your support that you get, the harder it is for you to say that it was because of what you did. So we've got this arrow here that shows that over time, the attribution and control association between what you've done and what the outcomes are gets weaker. This isn't the case always. Sometimes you'll be able to prove more that it was you all the way through, and you'll be controlling the outcomes because you may be the only organisation working with that person or that family or those animals, that environment. But generally, this is a bit of a trend that we see. So there are a couple of other elements to call out within the theory of change, within the outcomes. So it's important not only to record the positive outcomes that happen, you have to also record the negative outcomes. So we call them unintended consequences or bad outcomes, but it can be a positive thing to record them. So you'll remember the Eat My Lunch example. In there, the Eat My Lunch deliberately gives the lunches to the kids in brown paper bags because a potential negative outcome from their program is that children could feel stigmatized and be isolated from their peers because they've been identified as the poor children who can't afford a lunch. So if they didn't include that negative outcome, they wouldn't be able to track it and know whether their paper bag solution was working or not. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to include possible negative outcomes in a theory of change. It's really important to do that to make sure that you're not having unintended consequences and leading to more negative than positive. It's also important to keep in mind the counterfactual. What would have happened if you didn't exist at all? So while you're thinking that you're seeing positive change for people who've been in your program, just bear in mind whether, for example, were those the people that were already going to do well because they're the ones that found their way to your program, and so they were the ones that were already on an upwardly mobile trajectory, and even without your program, they might have shown positive change. And finally, we get to the impact, which is exciting when you've mapped everything else out. And often it's a bit of an aha moment for an organisation that they may have been like working forever on this activity, knowing that it seemed important, but not being able to isolate what impact they were having. Or it might be that they were trying to pick off too many things and you've helped them to refine and come in and land on like 1, 2, or 3 impact areas that they are seeking to achieve change around. The impact is essentially just the end of the line of the outcomes. So we've got short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, impact. Each of those just lead to each other. The long-term outcomes lead to the impact in the same way that the medium-term outcomes lead to the long-term outcomes. But there is real value in having an endpoint. The end point should be something that's within the realm of possibility that organisation could have an impact on. So Eat My Lunch, for example, shouldn't have as its end goal ending poverty because they're one organisation, they're unlikely to end poverty in their lifetime. My qualifier to that though is to say that if it's really important for the organisation to know what the end goal is, even though they know that they will never achieve it, it can still be part of their impact story, but they should say that there is a limited scope within which they are operating in. So I think I'm going to get to that later, but generally the story is have the impact be your end point and have it be something that's within the realm of possibility that you could achieve. Right. croaky voice. Okay, so once you've gone through all of those stages, hang on, just jumping around a bit. Once you've gone through all of those stages, it's important for you to challenge the logic. So all of those arrows within the theory of change that link up the outcomes, they should be challenged to see whether there's a logical flow. So here's an example of one, and then I'll come back to challenging the logic. This is the one that we talked about before, same example, but you'll notice behind there that there are magical stars hidden behind the outcomes. The magic in this theory of change is that parents are gaining confidence, reading to their children, increasing cognitive development, and arriving at school ready to learn. We think that's pretty great. That's enough magic. That's all we want. That's the magic that we want to see. If we were to take one of those outcomes out of there, we'd see the magic in behind there. And the way we would read the theory of change then would be parents gain confidence, and then the magic happens, and then we see increased cognitive development. Essentially, it's not logical. It's not logical that you jump from parents gain confidence to increased cognitive development. You need that one in between of the parents read to their children more. So you need to make sure there's no magic in your theory of change. It doesn't have a big gap in the logic in there. So essentially what you want is to read through the outcomes and check that there isn't a gap. I mentioned also earlier that it can be useful to identify your golden thread. So see here that down the bottom, the parents have a stronger support network. That's not leading to children arriving at school ready to learn. And so it's not highlighted golden because it's not part of the golden thread. The core golden thread in this theory of change is that parents gain confidence, they spend more positive time with their children and read to their children more, which leads to increased cognitive development so that children arrive at school ready to learn. So challenging the logic means checking whether the connections make sense, checking whether you've got to the root of the problem, checking whether checking what you've assumed and what is actually known. So is one of your arrows based on an assumption that you've got that you need to test, or is it based on something that's generally assumed that there's evidence out there for? And then finally, which of the activities and outputs are critical to achieving the outcomes and the impact? We think it's also really important that your theory of change respects the voice of the stakeholders and has been developed listening to those stakeholders. You can have logical links that are based on evidence, based on international evidence that's really compelling. But if you haven't spoken to the stakeholders in that community, the ones that actually experience the change, you might have missed something that's relevant to that particular community, which means that that international evidence wouldn't be relevant and wouldn't work here. For example, this might be a parenting program that looks really great on paper, but actually all of the children in these families are profoundly deaf. And so reading storybooks to them isn't going to lead to the same positive change that you want to have. So you've got to have to really respect the voice of the people who are experiencing the change and challenge your logic with them. So we're going to run through a few case studies. Any questions at this point? Feel free to write them in the notes if you'd prefer not to speak, but also I welcome any questions if anyone wants to ask them, or any comments from Chris and Nicola.
Clemmy, when you've done this in the past, what have you seen as the biggest challenges that the ventures have had to face when going through this process?
Yes, good question. So the biggest challenge, I think, is refining their focus on the impact. It's helpful to do it at the end of the process so that it's the culmination of the outcomes and they can clearly see that, okay, this is the area that we're well placed to create impact in. I think often organisations have a massive goal, and they think that this great thing that they're doing will achieve all of this change in all of these areas, which means they're spreading themselves really thin. And the process of refining their focus to just one impact area has such positive results for them. It helps them with all of their decision making to get that clarity. And often, like, I've had organisations in tears because they're so grateful that they've heard from their stakeholders that this is what's really changing for them and what matters for them. They've got that increased clarity and they've kind of got a way forward. Any other questions?
Hi. I have a question. As you mentioned in the outputs, the direct results, that if the change is not directly related, shall we point it out, note it, or let it go? If it's not directly related to the business, or if it is directly related to the business.
Yeah, cool. So the ancillary outcomes, the ones that aren't.
Yeah.
It depends on the story, what story you want to be telling. So if you've got another important thing to factor in when you're developing the theory of change is who the audience will be. So many social enterprises want to develop their theory of change so that they can communicate with their customers or their funders. And certain customers or funders might be particularly interested in one area, like housing, for example, and employment. And your social enterprise might be focused on employment, and so you've got the thread going all the way through to employment, but you're noticing also this actually really great outcome that's happening on the side with stability around housing. So because you're going to want to be able to communicate effectively to those stakeholders, we'd say keep the housing outcome in there, but maybe you would color code it a different thing so that the organisation isn't diverting resources towards supporting housing outcomes. They're just measuring it as they go, so that they can communicate better. We think
Thanks,
also, there's another point on that you can also include outcomes that aren't things that you've achieved, just color code them differently. But you might, if you've got a gap in your logic and you say, look, we're doing this, which leads to this, there's a gap in our logic, but what we need to see is this. So for example, we're employing people in our social enterprise cafe so that they've got the skills and resources so that they can go on and have successful careers in their lives. That might only work if you've got other employers who want to take on your people after they exit from you. And so you might have to include an outcome in there around other employers employ your staff, and you might need to partner with other people to achieve that outcome. It's fine to include other people's outcomes in your theory of change. Just identify that that's what's happening, that's through a partnership.
Thanks, Kami. There's one question's come through on text, and I can take a crack at answering it, and then you can fill in some of your other thoughts. The question was from Abigail and was, besides behavioural change, could you give us any other examples indicating the medium-term outcomes? And then when reaching the long-term outcomes, how do we measure its sustainability? So those outcomes are always going to be quite specific for the venture. So often some non-behavioural ones, you might see some economic indicators. So if we're seeking employment for an individual, for example, we might be able to say that in 9 months' time or 12 months' time, a certain percentage of them remained in long-term employment, or they'd moved from subsistence farming into sustainable farming, or farming that is now trading farming. It might be some economic style indicators. We might also see some health indicators. So you might, if your program is trying to improve the health of young, like newborns, for example, we might see that we could track the number of doctor visits or hospitalizations that infants have in the first 12 months and compare that to infants who weren't in the program. And in terms of the long term, how do we measure its sustainability? I'm not quite sure how to answer that one. When reaching the long-term outcome, Flemmy, the question is, when reaching the long-term outcome, how do we ensure its sustainability?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean, Abigail, if that's about the sustainability of the organisation, or how do we measure it sustainably. So I'll take a crack both ways, but how do we measure it in the long term? We acknowledge that it's often hard to measure the long-term outcomes because you often don't have contact with the people. We hope that generally the starting point is measure the early stage outcomes really well, the medium term to the extent that you can, and then rely on the evidence and the logic that links to the long-term impact, because we expect that there'll be a big drop off and there'll be a time lag between being able to measure the short term, medium term, and the long term. So it's do the best that you can, try and build relationships, try and build it into your program. I'll give the example of, I think I've given this example before, maybe on the first session, but there was a women's refuge that was really struggling to learn about the long-term change because they didn't have relationships, and they obviously couldn't call the women up after they'd left the service. So they changed their whole program, and they said, when women arrive at the refuge, they said, "Hi, welcome. Our way of operating is that we ask that you come back and visit us in 6 months' time, and ongoing every 6 months for a cup of tea, just to say hi after you've left." And so that gave them an opportunity to see how the women were going and do some data collection. But also they found that the benefit that the women had received from coming to the women's refuge dropped off significantly after they left the refuge if they didn't get offered that opportunity to come in for a cup of tea. Whereas being given that offer for a cup of tea made the women feel supported for much longer, even though it was a really small support that they got 6 months later. And so they saw not only did they have a data collection opportunity, they had it massively increased the impact of their service. So there are quite a few cool examples like that where you can actually build it into your service and add value to the stakeholders. Often it's something like a social interaction at some point with the people that they'd connected with around the service. And so, yeah, we encourage organisations to think of ways that they can lure people back in a way that actually provides value to them, but is also a data collection opportunity. But we'll get to measurement later on. Okay, cool. I'm going to run through a few case studies, and then I'll talk about some trends that we see in theories of change. Okay, so first case study here, we've got SkyEye Pacific. So it's an organisation based in Samoa that has a presence in a number of Pacific Island countries. They have clients across the spectrum of charities, NGOs, and development agencies, and they use drones to go up in the sky and film the land, take images, aerial mapping of the land, so that they can do things like support infrastructure development better and cheaper, do disaster mapping, preventative things where they go and look at the land and see whether there's likely to be a slip, or say if there was a slip, they could send the drone up and check the stability of the land so that the recovery crew can go in and clear the land without a risk of a further slip on top of them. And then they do things like they'll map the whole plot, the whole crop of coconut plantations on the island, so that the small farmers, who are predominantly women, had better information to plan their business with and be able to sell their products to market. So their goal is to make life easier in the Pacific. They also do vehicle tracking, so they put trackers on fleets of vehicles. So that's who they are, that's what they do. This is what their theory of change looks like. It may look overwhelming, but hopefully it's interesting for those of you who are wondering what a more complex theory of change could look like for a social enterprise that's doing a lot of interesting things. So I won't go through all of it, but you can see over on the left there, we've got the issue, the services, that's their activities, the stakeholders, that's their people, the people that are directly benefiting from the service. We've also got there the strategic response. Often we find that's helpful to include the strategic response. It's kind of like their values or their unique way of doing things, particularly in an organisation that's strong on culture. So, for example, a Aboriginal or Māori organisation who knows that if they don't deliver the service in their way, then they wouldn't achieve the outcomes. So it could, for example, be in a strengths-based way, or with culture at the core, or in a family-centric way. You can include that as your strategic response. So they do these things so that people have better, more accessible data, so that, and people use that data to make decisions. So they've empowered, they've got all these threads of change running through their theory of change. They've got along the top there that organisations are increasing their efficiency, and that's leading to more investment and better use of resources in Samoa. Through the middle there, we've got people working well and systems working well, again leading to better resource use. They've got increased well-being of people. They've got fewer traffic accidents, employees being safer, and more women having access to employment, and increased access to markets. So in the short term there, they've got that this organisation is hosting an online marketplace, which is increasing the connectivity for sellers and buyers. And in the medium term, they've got increased access to market for new sellers and buyers. So in the longer term, they've got that small business owners have market access, which is leading to more employment. And then through the bottom there, quite separate and different, they've got better environmental management. So they've got better identification of land risks and change, faster disaster response, better environmental management and mitigation, better advocacy for environment and disaster policy and investment, and better land management. So there's quite different areas of impact that they are achieving change in, and they've represented that with the different colour-coded threads that run through their theory of change. But basically it's a relatively linear theory of change. We start with what the activities are and who they're doing it with, run through a fairly linear process with different threads of change through it, leading to the ultimate impact of making life easier in the Pacific. Any thoughts or comments on that one?
I think, Clemmy, what's quite nice about this one is the way that those different threads make it clear about the different ways that they're influencing things. So where we started the session at a very simple linear model, this actually starts to show the participants in this program how there's actually a lot of interconnection and a lot of reliance of the different parts working together to achieve the final impact.
Yeah. And you can imagine how overwhelmed they were by the breadth of the impact that they were having before getting it all onto one page. That's put them in a much stronger position to measure and to communicate their impact. So just to blow your mind even more, we've got one that's not linear next. This one is a local New Zealand one. It's a organisation that's seeking to achieve positive change with young people, 10 to 13-year-olds. It's early intervention before kids got into trouble, but they're kids who are living in a disadvantaged situation or living in homes that suggest that they're likely to experience negative outcomes. So what they do is have an individualized approach for the young people. They have wraparound support. They use an Indigenous approach. It's the Māori approach here in New Zealand. They teach skills for how people can be the best they can be, and they support the young people to be free from drugs and alcohol, living healthy and happy lifestyles. So this is what their theory of change looks like. You can see that the oh, sorry, got ahead there. And sorry, just one question's come through. How can we avoid missing the list of, how can we avoid missing the list any outcomes?
I think
maybe, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I saw the question before. The thing I was going to say is we probably go into that more in the next session when we talk about how we work with the ventures to get all of these outcomes. So we'll partially answer that, but Clemmy, your thoughts as well?
Yeah, I think that stakeholder engagement is a really important part of that. And we'll talk about that next in the next session, more in the next session, but the rule of thumb I use is to keep asking questions until you stop hearing new things. So I often find that after, say, 10 interviews, what I'm hearing is the same as what I'd already heard. And so I've got relative confidence then that I've heard the main stories. And then again, you can draw up your hypothesis and you can test it further. You can go out and test more. Okay, so this is what the theory of change looks like. You can see that it's not linear. It doesn't look like what we were talking about before with the theory of change, where you list out your activities and then it goes on to outcomes and then your impact. With this one, it's deliberately not linear because they say that change doesn't happen for young people in a linear way. It doesn't go, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Young people are all different and they're experiencing change in weird and wonderful ways. And the program is trying its best to respond to all of those weird and wonderful ways that the young people change. So the way you read this is you start down the bottom at the left, and the change happens as waves of change. So in this first wave of change here, from the bottom left corner of the screen, we've got relationships being strengthened. So young people, tai tamariki, that means young person, they're developing positive relationships with their facilitators. They've got greater trust and engagement with the adults. They feel safe and supported. They're engaging in positive activities, and they've got improved communication skills and a sense of belonging. It was really important for this organisation to represent their theory of change in a way that calls out the importance of it being a cultural environment. So they've got increased awareness of Te Ao Māori at the top there. That's the Māori worldview. So after that first wave of change, the young people experience increased self-confidence. So they may have only experienced 2 of the changes in that wave, but once they're demonstrating increased self-confidence, the theory pushes them into the next wave of change. So they pass that threshold, they've got increased self-confidence, and then that opens up all these interesting, great outcomes in the second wave of change. So all the children, all the young people get past that threshold of self-confidence, and then they are set on a path to be able to experience positive outcomes in any of these different threads. And these threads represent the different dimensions of a holistic worldview in the Māori world. So those threads are having strong cultural identity, having self-determination and being self-determining, being healthy as a person and in a healthy environment, and having access to knowledge. So whichever thread is relevant for that young person, they'll experience positive change along that thread, or it may be in more than one thread. And then they'll have an increased sense of self. So through that middle thread, the culmination of that wave of change is that they have an increased sense of identity, increased sense of self. And then that leads to them graduating when they have increased sense of cultural identity, resilience, and reduced risk of unsafe drug and alcohol use. You'll see here also that the brown circles within the theory of change are the ones that the young person experiences, but the blue ones are the ones that they and or their family experience. So also it's important in a Māori worldview to recognise that no one's an island, no one experiences change by themselves. To be happy and confident and achieving positive outcomes, they also need their family to be achieving positive outcomes. So that's represented in here as well. And the reason I'm using this as a case study is to highlight how a theory of change can encompass the different worldviews of people in all sorts of different communities. It can be represented in whatever way resonates with the audience. It can demonstrate change in a way that is appropriate to that community. The only part that you can't let go of, the most important part, is to show that positive change over time. To show change over time and have it be logical. So there are still arrows threading through this, and the waves of change are logical. Okay, so these are just a couple of common trends that we're seeing. One of them, Abigail, you mentioned this about whether we see medium-term outcomes that aren't behaviour change. I think you're right that often the medium-term outcomes are behaviour change, particularly in these ones, the environmental ones, where we see organisations do a whole lot of things so that people's awareness increases around this environmental issue, so that they have knowledge of how to change things in that area, so that they actually do change things. And then as a consequence of them changing their behaviour, then you see all these environmental benefits. So, and if they don't change their behaviour as a consequence of it, then you're unlikely to see that environmental benefit. And another example here is the waves of change. So we see often in the social context, there's some similar trends that you start with your activity. The next thing that happens is trusted relationships. It's quite similar to the one I just spoke through, the New Zealand example. Start with the activity, build trust and confidence with the people that you're working with. That leads to the stakeholder, the parent in the parenting program, the young person, whoever it is, being engaged and confident around who you are and what you're doing. That could lead to developing skills or changing behaviour. That could lead to more aspirational goals, people setting their own goals and being on a path to do something that they want to do, moving on to them flying and whatever it is that is the area of change that they want to see. Any thoughts or comments on those frameworks or ideas of other trends that you've seen? This is just another framework that gets used, but we're just calling it out because it could be another example of a trend. Some of you might be familiar with Theory U, which is the process of ideation and building ideas collaboratively over time. And it also follows a common trend, which is that U shape. So we're just interested in observing common trends that might help you to give you some ideas of how change happens over time, that you can kind of keep in your back pocket while you're developing theories of change. Okay, so first, any questions about the theory of change that we've talked through? No? Okay. So once you've developed your theory of change, it's important to know that it's part of an iterative process. So you don't need your theory of change to be absolutely 100% perfect, because that's likely to stop you from progressing if you're worried that you can't progress until it's perfect. We think it's really valuable to develop your theory of change thinking of it as a hypothesis. It's your best guess based on the evidence that's available to you, of how you think change is happening or is likely to happen because of what you do. Once you've developed that hypothesis, you can test it. You can test it with the people who experience change by going and talking to them and saying, do you think this sounds right? Or you can test it by gathering data to test the links, to test the outcomes and see whether things are happening or not. So this iterative process we've got here, first we're saying, okay, what is the impact? What's the good thing that you want to be working towards? Who can you partner with? Who can you talk to? Who's in the community that's experiencing negative outcomes, who you can talk to and understand how you could address that issue together? How can you look, then you should look at the evidence. What if the rest of the world figured out works to address that issue? Then you define and refine your theory of change. That's what we talked about today. After you've developed your theory of change, you identify measures that help you collect data to know whether the outcomes within the theory of change are happening or not. You'll then begin gathering data using data collection tools against those indicators. You'll store and analyze your data, and after analyzing it, you'll report on it. And you'll use that analysis to learn whether what you're doing is working or not and whether you should tweak it. You can then communicate your impact to stakeholders based on what you've learned. And then you go around again. So based on your learnings, you challenge your theory of change and test and refine it again. So there are other methods that people are using. The theory of change is the one we're focusing on in this session because we think it's most relevant for the kinds of organisations you're working with. I'll just mention a few of the others. So results-based accountability was very popular, but it's losing popularity in favour of theory of change we're seeing globally. It's a similar-ish methodology. Social return on investment, actually I think I have a couple of slides for the other two. Social return on investment is a much more detailed process. It's a methodology that involves developing a really robust theory of change and understanding how change happens for stakeholders and prioritizing certain change over others and asking those stakeholders to what extent they experience change and for how long, and using those bits of data and other evidence that you've got to put a financial proxy against each of the outcomes within the theory of change so that you can determine what the social return what the financial social return is on the financial investment that you put into that work. So the result of a social return on investment analysis is a big long report setting out all of the positive change that people have experienced, and then a ratio that says this was the dollars invested and this is the equivalent dollar value of that's come out of that program. Happy to answer any questions on those. Generally, they take about 6 months to do a social return on investment analysis, or much longer if you're collecting data over time. So probably that's not the level of detail or the level of effort that many of the organisations you're working with will be able to go to. And then over the final one on there is the impact management project. So that's a much simpler framework and it's being used really broadly amongst impact investors. It has, I'll skip ahead, this is what their framework looks like. So it helps investors and others see that the more focused you are on one particular impact area, the deeper you're going with your positive change or the broad going, and the more long-term you're being in trying to create change, the more likely it is that you're contributing to solutions, to systemic change for people in the planet. If you're taking a more scattergun approach, you're funding a lot of people in a lot of different ways, then it's more likely that you're in that middle column of benefiting stakeholders. So this is a framework that's quite useful for impact investors, and We sometimes find it useful to use this framework to help organisations see why it's beneficial to refine their focus, but we don't think that this framework is as useful as theory of change because it doesn't help you measure change over time. It's more like in a way that you can take a portfolio, take a snapshot of where your portfolio is at. Okay, so as we've said throughout this, make sure that you can just get started by getting clear on your goal. So to reiterate, the theory of change is a valuable way of identifying what the ultimate impact is that you want to have so that you can see your goal. Because if you can see your goal, you're more likely to get there. And if you can't see your goal, you're shooting blind. So any final questions or thoughts? Okay, so homework then. For the homework for this week, we ask you to review the handout notes and to create a theory of change for the Eat My Lunch example. So you're familiar with the Eat My Lunch example because of the last homework assignment. Most of you got most of the way there with the components of the theory of change in the assignment by identifying what the activities and the outcomes were. Now we encourage you to write that up in the theory of change under the headings that we've talked about in this assignment, in this session. So what's the issue that they're seeking to address? What are the activities that they're doing? Who are their stakeholders, the people or the planet? Which people? What are the outputs? What are the short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes? And finally, what is the impact that Eat My Lunch is seeking to have? Any final comments, Chris, from you, or anyone else, any questions?
Yeah, just a reminder for me, to everybody, to make sure that they've booked their meeting with a venture, which will be a key component for delivering the homework assignment number 3. So the information on that was in the first module information, but we will repost the details on Slack for everybody around what date it needs to be done by. And that will be an opportunity for you to actually practice some of this information. And what we'll be doing in the next module is giving you all of the tools and the questions and the processes and a PowerPoint presentation that you can use with that venture to explain theory of change to them, and then also create a theory of change. And it's a really key part of the learning process for you. It's the first step of helping you understand this is explaining it to you, but actually practicing it is a really vital step.
Great, thanks Chris, and thanks everyone else for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.